Number 10 is To Open the Sky by Robert Silverberg, published in 1967, and this, at the time of recording, has 350 ratings on Goodreads. This is an early Robert Silverberg novel which is starting to explore some of the themes that become common in his work as it progresses through the late 60s and 70s. It's set in a world where humanity have colonised Mars and also Venus, and it is centred around a quasi-religious cult known as the Vorsters. And the Vorsters worship these nuclear reactors which are glowing blue. They have these kind of chapels where they perform these elaborate prayer rituals, and their primary goal is to foster and cultivate the development of these telepathic humans, with the ultimate goal of having them develop telekinetic powers so that they can send spaceships using mental energy into the distant stars. And we sort of have this narrative leapfrogging where we jump from character to character across a number of years, jumping between Earth, Mars, and Venus. And on Venus you have these humans who have been initially genetically modified to have these gill-like organs on their necks so that they can breathe the hostile alien atmosphere. And the core tension revolves around a breakaway cult known as the Harmonists, who feel that the Vorsters' original vision has been corrupted by a heavy focus on commercialism and an almost messianic role that their leader has taken on. It's Robert Silverberg, so it is solid, but I do think that he is trying to take on a little bit too much in a relatively short novel, and ultimately I do feel like it buckles under the weight of its own ambition a little bit. But you're starting to see here Robert Silverberg shaping and moulding and refining his writing to pave the way for some future masterpieces. So while I don't necessarily think it is a good book, I don't really think it's a bad one. And it probably makes sense that it's not as widely read today, because if you're going to go out and pick up a Robert Silverberg novel, there are many better choices than this one. Also, just to touch on the method of this video a little bit, Goodreads is not a particularly useful tool if you are a science fiction fan, because many great works have faded into obscurity and are no longer widely read. Many of them are no longer in print, and so modern audiences can't get their hands on these books easily, and there's not that many resources out there to tell them which ones are even worth reading. But I couldn't think of any other method to go about this video, so that's what I'm doing. It's based on Goodreads ratings. Number 9 is The Florians by Brian M. Stableford, published in 1976. And this one only has 148 ratings on Goodreads, so quite a jump down from the Robert Silverberg book. This one is the first book in a series known as the Daedalus Mission, I think. It's set in a world where humanity sent a number of generation starships to distant worlds to establish colonies. But at the time that they did this, there was no method of communication over such vast distances. And so Earth has no idea how these colonies are getting on, whether those humans are even still surviving on the worlds that they ventured out to, and what the nature of those worlds even is. Now though, a ship called the Daedalus has been constructed, which is like a mobile laboratory which is being sent out to each one of these colony worlds to investigate these human colonies, determine what kind of issues they're facing with regards to these alien environments, potentially with native beings or with industry and technology, with the aim of assisting them with those issues and the hope of establishing a network of worlds which will now be able to communicate with the technology available to Earth today and engage in trade. So this book follows the first Daedalus mission, heading out to a planet called Floria, and when they arrive on Floria, they find that the colony seems to be doing pretty well. the humans there have begun to establish these pastoral farming villages, and they're even in the process of constructing a railway network across the planet. But the humans on Floria, the Florians, have evolved into these 9, 10, 11 foot tall giants. And they don't really seem that concerned with the human visitors from Earth. They don't seem particularly interested in establishing communication with their home planet, and they're not really determined to be part of this ambitious network of worlds. And so the crew start to investigate why these humans have grown to such an enormous size, which leads to some really interesting ecological and biological science that's revealed in quite a cool way, with a mystery that does string you along. I actually left this one feeling like I did want to go and read the rest of the Daedalus series, because I do think it's quite a compelling concept. I think this book is a decent read, and it probably does deserve more than the 148 ratings that it does have on Goodreads. Number 8 is Miracle Visitors by Ian Watson, published in 1978, and this one has 141 ratings on Goodreads. This one is really tackling the UFO phenomenon from a slightly different angle. We're following a psychologist who is treating these patients who have claimed to have had encounters with UFOs or even abductions, and he is going through these hypnotic therapy sessions which are allowing these patients to recall these repressed memories of these encounters or these abductions. And the central theory that the psychologist has in Miracle Visitors is that these UFO encounters are actually a physical manifestation of collective mental energies projected by the public consciousness. So I do think that this is a really unique lens to look at the UFO phenomenon through, although I do think that in this one, Ian Watson gets himself tangled up with these ideas, and it doesn't end up forming a coherent, cohesive narrative. And overall, I didn't really enjoy this one very much, and I can see why it has faded into obscurity in the way that it has. Number 7 is 3 Worlds to Conquer by Paul Anderson, published in 1964, and this one has 128 ratings on Goodreads. This one follows 2 key plot lines. One of them is an alien being on Jupiter, and his civilization is being invaded by a warring tribe of aliens, but he is in contact with a human on Ganymede via this radio device, and he sees this human as almost like a godlike entity and comes to him for advice and questions about the universe. This human character on Ganymede is also experiencing an invasion from another group of humans, which are these kind of political anarchist group. And so you have these parallel invasion stories of different races being oppressed by other groups of their own race, and they are in radio communication the entire time. It's a really short novel. I thought it was really terrible. I think this one was the worst science fiction book that I read in 2024. I think it's really badly written. I think structurally there are massive problems. And the biggest issue, I think, for me is that the characters are not distinct in any way. They just meld together. You can't tell at times who you are reading. They don't have unique voices, and the plot just doesn't do anything interesting. This is a case where I think certain books have faded into obscurity because they are so bad that there is no real reason to go back and read them, and there is no real reason to recommend them to other people. Unless you are, for some reason, doing a completionist read of all of Paul Anderson's work. I've read one other book by him that I reviewed recently, which was Tau Zero. I didn't like that one either. I don't think Paul Anderson is an author for me, and I don't recommend this book. Alright then, next up we've got The Moment of Eclipse by Brian Aldiss, published in 1970, and this one has 120 ratings on Goodreads. And this is where we're going to see a bit of a pattern start to emerge in this list, because this is a collection of short stories. And what I've noticed is that short stories, science fiction short stories, aren't as widely read anymore, and a lot of these collections and anthologies have a really low number of ratings and reviews. I'd read a couple of Brian Aldiss books in the past, being Hot House and Non-Stop. I thought both of those were excellent, so I decided to give some of his short fiction a go. And what I discovered was a series of short stories here which are really pushing the boat out to the far shores of the science fiction genre. They are strange and experimental and at times confusing, with many of the stories here being inspired by Aldiss's stationing in India during World War II. So many of the stories are either set in India or feature Indian characters or are inspired by Indian culture. And that gives this one quite a unique flavour. I did say in my review of this one that if I would have read it early into my science fiction reading journey, I think I would have hated it. But now I am more willing to take on these more challenging works and meet the author in some kind of conceptual middle ground. So I had a decent time with this one, trying to unpick what Brian Aldiss was doing, but I would be lying if I said that I totally understood every story in here. Some of them left me scratching my head. I had to frequently look things up, and ultimately that led to something that I found to be a satisfying experience in the end. Brian Aldiss is quickly becoming one of my favourite writers, but I do understand why this one is obscure in the way that it is. I wouldn't recommend it to most science fiction readers, but if you do feel like you are a more seasoned reader in the genre, or you're just more willing to take on strange and challenging work, then this one could be for you. Number 5 is Overlay by Barry Malzberg, published in 1972. And this is quite a jump now because it goes down to 92 ratings on Goodreads at the time of recording. Before I made this video, I turned my room upside down looking for this book because I do own it and it has a very cool cover, which I've put on the screen somewhere, but I just can't find it. It has gone missing, and that's really disappointing because it's not an easy book to find. I mean, evidently so. This one is about an alien race who have determined that humanity are too dangerous to carry on their current trajectory, and there is no chance that they will be allowed into this kind of galactic civilization. And so this alien agent is tasked with facilitating the downfall of human civilization in a way that's subtle and not like some of the alien invasion stories that you've seen before. The method that this agent takes is to infiltrate the minds of a number of horse players, these people that bet on horse racing, and push and influence them into making decisions through their gambling that will start this chain reaction or this domino effect that will lead to catastrophic events that ultimately sees humanity collapse. That sounds incredibly strange because it is, and it is fascinating to witness how Malzberg gets to where he's going. That being said, I don't think this one's necessarily a compelling read the entire way through, because Malzberg did immerse himself in the world of horse betting, and you can feel that here. He's really diving into the technicalities of horse betting in a way that's not always super interesting to read, but I do think that the grander narrative and vision is something really unique and interesting, and in the end Malzberg does achieve something quite profound. In a similar way to the Aldiss collection, I can see why this one has faded into obscurity in the way that it has, because it is a bit more challenging than many more popular tales of alien beings taking down human civilization. But I would say the same thing. If you're up for something a little bit more chewy and a little bit more challenging, then definitely give Overlay by Barry Malzberg a go. Number 4 is In the Footsteps of the Abominable Snowman by Joseph Nesvadba, published in 1970. And this is another big jump down because this only has 36 ratings on Goodreads. I picked this one up in a charity shop because of the cover art featuring those abominable snowmen creatures on the front of it. And there's also an introduction from Brian Aldiss, who I've mentioned is becoming one of my favourite science fiction authors. Josef Nesvadba is a Czech author, and Aldiss describes an encounter that he had with Nesvadba in the Czech Republic and how his writing went on to influence his own. And once again, continuing that theme, this is a collection of short stories from Josef Nesvadba, where again he's dancing this line between science fiction, fantasy, historical fiction, weird fiction, and many of these stories are dealing with Nazi Germany or the world wars in general, or more specifically colonial Africa, which pops up a number of times, resulting in a collection that feels distinct and unique, but never really too memorable or well written. And I think I'm going to give Nesvadba the benefit of the doubt here, because I think the translation from Czech to English is probably not the best, but even so, I don't think any of the content in here is really worth recommending, and so I do see why this one only has 36 ratings on Goodreads. Number 3 is Winter's Children by Michael G. Coney, published in 1974, and this one only has 28 ratings on Goodreads. This is set in a world that is undergoing another ice age, and human civilization has entirely collapsed, and the Earth's surface is covered in thick layers of ice and snow. We're following a group of survivors who are living in this old church building, which is completely submerged beneath the snow and ice, except for a bell tower, which is extending out to the surface, and climbing up into this bell tower is how the survivors access the surface and head out to scavenge for food and supplies. So you can see that bell tower there on the cover. As well as needing to scavenge for supplies, they are facing off against another group of humans known as the Flesh Hunters. And all of the people in this world traverse the snow and the ice on these sleds powered by sails, harnessing the harsh winds that the world is now experiencing. So you do get some really memorable battle scenes of these sleds tearing across the ice, with the characters firing guns at each other and jumping between these vessels like pirates or something. In addition to the Flesh Hunters, there are these big furry creatures known as pads, which are seemingly exhibiting some telepathic ability. I think that there's enough enjoyable content in here with this sort of atmospheric feel, these melancholic characters, and these exciting action sequences. The biggest problem that I had with the book is that the plot does feel meandering, with much of the short page count lacking focus or direction or a clear end destination. So I do like this one. I think it has problems, but overall I do think it deserves way more than 28 ratings on Goodreads. Number 2 is Analog 3, edited by John W. Campbell Jr., published in 1968. And this one only has 13 ratings on Goodreads. Once again, it's an anthology of short stories collected from Analog Science Fiction and Fact magazine, which John W. Campbell Jr. was an editor of. He's obviously an incredibly important figure in the genre, responsible really for elevating these stories out of the pulp era, placing a much bigger emphasis on scientific accuracy or plausibility, and looking for better quality in the writing itself. I think that the stories in here are mostly typical of what you see from the golden age of science fiction in my experience, showcasing the problem with placing an emphasis on scientific accuracy, I think, because a lot of the stories in here are really forgettable. They're dry, they're boring, and they're uninteresting. Off the top of my head, the one I can remember is about a young man from a village in Appalachia where everyone has telepathic abilities, and he is shipped off in the military to the other side of the United States, and he is conversing mentally across the country with his mother. But when he does this, because this is such a vast distance that he's communicating across, these telepathic communions act as like an EMP, absorbing power from nearby energy sources, effectively shutting off all of the lights and the machinery in the military base. And when the military realise what's happening, they decide to use this young man's ability for their own good. They decide to weaponize it, which I think was a good story. I can't really remember any of the others off the top of my head, but there are some well-known authors in here, like Gordon Dixon and Clifford Simak. So if you're gonna head out and look for some short story anthologies or collections from the golden age of science fiction, I wouldn't recommend that it's this one. But I might recommend the next one, which is number 1, The Old Masters by Brian Davis, published in 1970, with only 11 ratings on Goodreads at the time of recording, and only 3 written reviews. One of those is my review. I made a dedicated video to this on my last upload, so I'm not going to talk about this one too much. You can go and watch that one where I break down each story individually and give an outline summary of it. But again, this is an anthology of science fiction short stories from the golden age with some authors who are incredibly well known, such as Arthur C. Clarke, John Wyndham, James Blish, and Brian Aldiss. And really, I think what sets this apart from the Analog 3 collection that I was just talking about is that these stories see these authors pushing the boundaries a little bit and going above and beyond what many other golden age science fiction writers were doing, at times getting experimental or tapping into new concepts that I've not seen done in this era. There's a little bit of mystery over who Brian Davis is. I did dig into that a little bit and I talked about that in the other video, so go and check that one out if you are intrigued. But I do think that this one is fairly good. I enjoyed my time with it, and it probably does deserve more reads and reviews on Goodreads. So there you go, that's the current 10 most obscure science fiction books that I've ever read, according to Goodreads ratings. And I should just acknowledge that I'm relatively early into my science fiction reading journey. I've only read a couple of hundred books at this point, and there are a number of books that I've got on my TBR that would crack this list if I were to go and read them, but I haven't read them yet, so I'm not going to talk about them here. Maybe that means I will do an updated version of this video in the next couple of years when I have read those books, because I do think there is something exciting about trying to mine for these hidden gems in the genre and showcase them to the world, to try and put them on people's radar where they might not be. Because many of you are much more well-read in the genre than I am, I would love to hear what the most obscure science fiction books that you've ever read are. If you go onto Goodreads, there is an option to sort your read books by the number of ratings that they have, which is the method that I use to put together this video. So if you can be bothered, go onto the Goodreads platform, do that, and then in the comments let me know what your top 10 most obscure science fiction reads are, along with the number of ratings, or just give me your top 1, 2, or 3. Thank you very much for watching, liking, and subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one.